Okay, so today we are going to continue our discussion of legal segregation that emerged in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, what is commonly referred to as the era of Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow laws were in effect roughly from the 1890s until the 1960s, and it codified a system of racial apartheid that dominated the American South and affected almost every aspect of daily life. Now, where does this name Jim Crow come from? And why did it get associated with segregation laws in this country? Well, as you can imagine, Jim Crow is a derogatory term. It dates back to before the Civil War in the early 1830s, when a white actor named Thomas Dartmouth Rice was propelled to stardom for performing minstrel routines as the fictional Jim Crow, a caricature of a clumsy, dim-witted black slave. Rice later appropriated the Jim Crow persona into a minstrel act where he painted his face black and performed jokes and songs in a stereotypical slave dialect. Rice was certainly not the first white comic to perform in blackface, but he was the most popular of his time, touring both the United States and England. And it was this name Jim Crow that became associated with the laws put in place in the United States, primarily in the South, that denied blacks basic political and civil rights. So how did this happen? How did we end up with two Americas, one for whites and one for blacks? And how was this legally permissible? As you recall, in the decades immediately following the Civil War, roughly the years between 1865 and 1895, white Southerners were forced to confront the new reality of having their former slaves living amongst them as freed men and women. This was a radical change for people who had only known slavery and who had been used to treating African Americans as property, not people. This new reality for Southern whites meant that many of them were determined to maintain and enforce white supremacy. African Americans may be legally free, but to maintain white control in the South, they needed to keep their former slaves from voting and obtaining political power. Blacks still formed the backbone of the Southern Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, and won numerous elective positions during Reconstruction. In North Carolina, for example, 11 African Americans served in the state Senate and 43 in the House between 1877 and 1890. In Mississippi, Hiram Revels, pictured here, was elected by the state Senate to finish the term of one of the state's two seats in the U.S. Senate. Well, this idea of African Americans gaining political power was simply unacceptable to racist whites. To change this dynamic and to prevent blacks from holding more official positions at the state and national level, Southern white leaders instituted a number of measures designed to keep blacks from voting. They did this primarily through the use of poll taxes or by adopting new state constitutions that required voters to possess property or pass a literacy test. So let's run through each of these real quick so you can understand what each of these entailed. A poll tax is essentially what it means. A citizen must pay a fee or a tax in order to vote. The tax is the same for all black and white, but this allowed the generally more affluent white population access to the polls, while the generally poor black population would have trouble justifying trading food on the table for a vote in the ballot box. Imagine today, for example, if New York City required every citizen in the 5 boroughs to pay a $500 poll tax in order to vote in the next local or presidential election. I'm sure many of you would opt not to spend that money, choosing instead to spend your $500 on your college tuition, books for your classes, rent, clothes, subway passes, and so on. A measure like this would favor the wealthy in New York, perhaps Wall Street bankers who could afford the $500 poll tax. And they may vote differently because they have different interests and different needs. Other states chose to use literacy tests instead of poll taxes. These states would require all voters to pass a test assessing their ability to read. Tens of thousands of former slaves obviously did not have the ability to read, and therefore this prevented them from voting and enabled whites to maintain power. Property qualifications. Well, just like a poll tax, this was targeted at many poor African Americans and former slaves who did not own or could not afford to purchase property and therefore did not meet the requirements to vote. So any citizen who failed a reading test, could not sign his name, did not own a minimum amount of property, or could not pay a poll tax, lost his right to vote. The citizens who failed these tests most frequently were blacks, who formed the poorest and least educated segment of the population. Now, obviously, there were many poor whites in the South who did not own property, could not afford a poll tax, or could not pass literacy tests. And so to get around this, many state constitutions included grandfather clauses, which stated that if a person or the person's father or grandfather were eligible to vote in a particular year, usually the late 1860s, before blacks were guaranteed the right to vote by the Constitution and before many of these provisions like poll taxes went into effect, then that person was eligible to vote. This was another way of privileging white voters who were grandfathered in and disenfranchising black voters. Such restrictions proved effective. As you can see from the map, across the South, black voter turnout plunged from above 70% to about 34% or even lower in the late 19th century. These measures were challenged in the Supreme Court several times, but the Supreme Court said these measures were constitutional because in the court's mind, they applied equally to both black and white. The Supreme Court in 1896 also weighed in on another major issue that examined whether it was legally permissible to segregate whites and blacks in public facilities of all kinds: bathrooms, trains, schools, theaters, etc. The case, Plessy v. Ferguson, originated with Louisiana's infamous Separate Car Act of 1890. The Separate Car Act required African Americans and whites to sit in segregated compartments on public carriers in Louisiana. The case was brought to court by civil rights advocates on behalf of Homer Plessy, a New Orleans resident who was of mixed race, of black and European descent. Plessy had purchased a first-class ticket, but was arrested after he refused to give up his seat and moved to the colored car in defiance of the Separate Car Act. Plessy challenged his arrest, believing that it was a violation of his 14th Amendment right, which provided for equal treatment under the law. The Supreme Court disagreed with Plessy. In a landmark ruling that would enshrine segregation in the United States for the next 60 years, the court ruled that such segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as blacks had access to accommodations that were separate but equal to those of whites. This meant that so long as there was a train car for blacks, or if a black park designated an area or a restroom for blacks, a state or city could legally segregate whites and blacks. The doctrine of separate but equal that grew out of Plessy was monumental for race relations in this country. It provided the legal authority for public facilities to segregate based on race. This meant that blacks and whites would have to use different drinking fountains or public restrooms. This meant that there would now be theaters for whites and blacks, or that blacks would have to use a different entrance to the theater. It also meant that hotels, restaurants, streetcars, trains, and eventually sports stadiums and other public facilities could exclude or segregate people based on their race. Perhaps the area that this had the biggest impact on was public schools. Across the South, black and white children attended segregated schools until 1954, and even later when the Supreme Court and Brown v. Board of Education finally struck down the doctrine of separate but equal. We'll come back to Brown in more detail in another lecture. But what the emergence of legally segregated schools did was it highlighted the fact that separate but equal was a myth. Segregated facilities in the South were flagrantly inferior and clearly discriminated, but the court allowed them to stand. The Plessy decision only accelerated a downward spiral in race relations in the country in which blacks became the scapegoats of white rage. Lynching, for example, peaked between 1890 and 1910. While most common in the South, they occurred in almost every state from Oregon and Minnesota to New York. About a quarter of lynching victims were accused of assault, rarely proved on a white woman. Most, however, had simply said or done something that made insecure whites feel disrespected, or they had succeeded in business or taken a job that made whites feel inferior. After many lynchings, such as this one in the town of Center, Texas in 1920, crowds posed to have their pictures taken with the victims. Commercial photographers often, as in this case, produce photographic postcards to sell as souvenirs. Well, what do we make of these gruesome rituals? Who is in this crowd and who is not? What do we learn from the fact that this group of white men, some of whom may have been responsible for the lynching, felt comfortable having their photographs recorded with the body? The victim in this photograph, a young man named Lidge Daniels, was seized from the local jail by a mob that broke down the prison door to kidnap and kill him. So how did African Americans respond to these new conditions?